Penguin Random House Audio presents To Lose a War, The Fall and Rise of the Taliban. This is the author, Jon Lee Anderson. Preface. Afghanistan has always been more of a battleground of history than it has been a nation. Landlocked, bounded by deserts and rugged mountains, it is a geographically strategic crossroads between Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, and has drawn foreign powers with visions of conquest since ancient times. Pivotal invasions were made by Alexander the Great in 330 BC and by the Mongols in 1222. These were followed by two British colonial forays in the 19th century and another in 1919. All of them were ultimately defeated in warfare with the hardy Afghans, who earned a reputation for cunning, bravery, and mercilessness on the battlefield. 6 decades after the British departed, the Soviets invaded, but after a bloody military occupation that lasted 10 years, they too were forced to withdraw, having not only failed to subjugate the Afghans, but sparking off an armed resistance that has become endemic and hydra-headed over time. For most Americans, awareness of Afghanistan probably began with the 9/11 terror attacks orchestrated by Osama bin Laden, the Saudi jihadist who had found sanctuary there. Bin Laden's hosts were the Taliban, an army of pious Islamists who had seized power violently a few years earlier during the chaotic backwash of the Soviet retreat. Following 9/11, the Americans launched an invasion of Afghanistan with the goal of unseating the Taliban and punishing bin Laden's al-Qaeda terror network. They quickly achieved both these aims, but then stayed on for another 20 years, variously engaged in counterinsurgency and nation-building efforts. It all ended in 2021 when, after failing to thwart a steadily growing Taliban resurgence, the war-weary U.S. pulled out its last troops, and the Taliban marched back into Kabul. I spent time on Afghanistan's battlegrounds in the late 1980s during the prolonged Soviet retreat, as rival mujahideen factions united in an unsuccessful campaign to wrest control from Moscow's client regime. My observations on those experiences can be found in Guerrillas, a book I wrote about a number of modern insurgencies. In the wake of 9/11, I returned to Afghanistan and spent most of the next year reporting there for The New Yorker. In 2002, I published The Lion's Grave, a book-length collection of my Afghan articles that was intended to serve as a chronicle of the first year of the American presence in Afghanistan. At that point, the mission of the U.S. and its coalition allies appeared to have been a qualified success, thanks to its partnership with an array of Afghan warlords. The Taliban had vanished into the hills, as had al-Qaeda, and a pliant new pro-Western regime had been installed. A parallel narrative of The Lion's Grave was the story of the death of Ahmad Shah Massoud, a charismatic mujahideen leader who was assassinated by al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan 2 days before the 9/11 attacks took place in the United States. Massoud's killing appeared to have been an essential part of the larger al-Qaeda conspiracy, yet had remained largely unexamined. Intrigued, I investigated the circumstances of Massoud's murder, and on the first anniversary of his death, attended a ceremony held at a new mausoleum erected in his honor in his home village in the Panjshir Valley. I chose to end my book with the scene of that ceremony, which also gave the book its title. During the anti-Soviet resistance war waged by the Mujahideen, Massoud had earned acclaim as the Lion of the Panjshir for his leadership role in thwarting successive Soviet military offensives launched into the narrow mountain valley. The road that ran through the Panjshir was still littered with destroyed tanks and vehicles from those days, but in the end, the Panjshir had also become Massoud's tomb. I had always found Afghanistan a deeply compelling place, and was happy to be reporting there again, but unexpectedly soon I found myself drawn to a new theater of war in Iraq, the next battleground in the so-called War on Terror that had been declared by President George W. Bush. I left Afghanistan, but before long I was back. The Taliban were having a resurgence, and the American project in Afghanistan had begun to acquire the look and feel of a quagmire. I traveled there in 2005, in 2007, in 2010, and again in 2011. Eventually, distracted once more by new conflicts erupting in Libya, Syria, and elsewhere, it would be an entire decade before I returned, in late 2021, a few months after the catastrophic American retreat and the Taliban's momentous return to power. Given everything that has happened, it feels appropriate to look back over the entire 20-year arc of the American presence in Afghanistan. To do so, I've reconceived The Lion's Grave, expanding its focus to include the stories I wrote on my return trips, in the hope they provide a narrative chronology to my growing apprehension about the U.S. project there. The Lion's Grave has therefore become To Lose a War, an altogether different book, one that examines the American enterprise in Afghanistan from its dramatic beginning all the way to its hapless end. Some of my apprehensions came early on, as I sought out a ground-level understanding of Afghanistan in the run-up to the U.S. invasion, as it took place, and then in its aftermath. I had glimpses of a society that didn't fit easily into the good Afghans versus bad Taliban box. In the earliest chapters, The Warlord, Chapter 2, In the Court of the Pretender, Chapter 3, The Surrender, Chapter 4, and City of Dreams, Chapter 5, I share encounters that I had with some Afghans who felt threatened by the sudden arrival of Westerners in their country, and who, perhaps, retained an allegiance to the arch-conservative Taliban. In the newly liberated capital, Kabul, a shopkeeper upbraided me angrily for speaking with a burqa-clad woman who had approached to ask me for help. During my excursions on the city's outskirts, curious groups of boys invariably assembled and then began throwing stones whenever a Western woman appeared. In Chapter 6, Holy and Other Warriors, I describe a December 2001 trip to the mountainous redoubt known as Tora Bora, where the U.S. military believed they had cornered bin Laden, but where, after several weeks of fighting, they had lost track of him. I recount my meetings with wildly unreliable mujahideen commanders, men who had presented themselves as American allies, but who were also suspected of having helped bin Laden escape. Another unreliable figure was Jack Edema, a bombastic former U.S. Special Forces officer who had cut his own deals with Afghan warlords. Edema went on to run a rogue anti-terror operation for which, after being found torturing suspects in a private jail, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison for his crimes. Edema's murky official affiliations and his ability to operate unhindered in the lee of the U.S. war in Afghanistan for several years seemed to say something about the creeping and chaotic nature of the American mission. Following the Taliban retreat from their stronghold in the southern city of Kandahar, things still felt tenuous in January 2002. It was there that the Taliban had made their final stand several weeks before, only to mysteriously vanish from the battlefield. A young man assisting the new government authorities, who had previously worked for the Taliban, disclosed that his former employers had all decamped across the border to the southern Pakistani city of Quetta, where they enjoyed the backing of the Pakistani intelligence services, who were playing both sides in the U.S. war against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. As time would show, he was telling the truth. The Taliban had made a tactical withdrawal, but were still intact, having resolved to remain in the shadows until they felt ready to resume the fight. In Kandahar, I paid a visit to Mullah Naqib, who had been my mujahideen host years earlier during the anti-Soviet war. In a story I tell in Chapter 7, Mullah Omar's favorite songs, Naqib was under a cloud of suspicion from the American newcomers for his friendly ties to the former Taliban leaders, including its fugitive spiritual leader, Mullah Omar, who had bequeathed him his fleet of luxury Toyota Land Cruisers before making his escape. Where did Naqib's loyalties lie in the new Afghanistan? It was difficult to know. He was, first and foremost, a survivor. In the spring of 2002, I returned to Kabul and, together with the photographer Thomas Dworzak, my friend and companion since the first days of the war, rented a traditional Afghan house to live in. It was located on a street with many florist shops.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?